some latecomers, obviously. So welcome, everybody. Great to have you all here. My name's Jamie. I'm the head of education at the HCPC, and we're here today to talk about the findings from our annual report, particularly linking in with interprofessional education. So I'll be taking us through the first few slides of this, and then my colleague Louise will be presenting the substantive kind of findings, I suppose, from interprofessional education. Bit of housekeeping. So like I said, we'll do a presentation. There is a Q&A discussion session as well. We've got everybody's microphones and cameras on mute and off at the moment, but we can unmute you and switch your cameras on when we hit the Q&A session. You can feel free, though, to add questions via the Q&A function or the chat if you would like to do that as we go through, and we will come back to those questions in the Q&A session, like I was saying. So agenda for today, I'll be taking us through a summary of our education function at HCPC. I'll start us off on the focus on interprofessional education, then Louise will take over, like I said. We'll have a Q&A discussion, and then there's a short kind of outro about further reading materials and kind of sources of guidance, those kinds of things. So education function at the HCPC, what do? We set and maintain education standards. Those standards are output focused to ensure that those who complete programs meet our requirements for registration, so namely our standards of proficiency and our standards of conduct, performance and ethics. We in the education team approve institutions and programs against those standards, the education standards, and that's part of our statutory function. It's set in the legislation that we need to do that. So we make decisions about the initial approval of providers and programs, and then once that decision has been made, we monitor data, intelligence and information on an ongoing basis, and then we ask education providers to engage with us at fixed points to reflect on the ongoing quality of their provision. And the key thing here is that once somebody completes an approved program, they can apply to our register to become registered professionals. So how do we do that? So we have a quality assurance model that's in place. The aim of that is that we are flexible, intelligent and data-led in our quality assurance of institutions and programs. And we have 4 key pillars which kind of underline and run underpin the work that we do. Firstly, institution program level assessment. So we do assess the right areas at the right time. So whether our institution approaches, we will assess those across an institution, and that's particularly relevant where education providers deliver lots of different programs across different professional groups. But then obviously we delve into the professional level and the program level where we need to make sure that that program's delivering individuals that meet our proficiency standards and our standards of conduct, performance and ethics. We're flexible in our assessment, so it's not one size fits all. We apply a right touch regulatory model, which is where we understand problems before jumping to solutions. So we will always understand things like context within that, and make sure that we are understanding the kind of specific assessment that we're undertaking, rather than undertaking a one size fits all approach. We use data and intelligence to inform that. I've already mentioned data and intelligence, but we use that on an ongoing basis and also to help inform our decisions. And we have a 4 nations and regional approach as well. So we have members of my team that understand each UK nation and English region, and are able to contextualize assessments and understand those assessments based on what's happening within certain nations and regions. So our annual report, it's an annual report from the 21-22 and 22-23 academic years. It sets out a state of the nation for education training in the 15 professions that we regulate. It's focused on kind of key areas linked to the quality of education programs and challenges faced by the sector, kind of all linking back to our standards and how those are met and delivered. Our intention with this report and these engagement exercises, so these webinars particularly, is to provide insight to our stakeholders about what we found when undertaking assessments of education providers and programs. We want to enable really good conversations about the key areas that we've picked out, anything that needs to change, and also if there's advice for education providers, we can give that too. And we're probably primarily thinking today that the audience of this session will be education providers. We do appreciate that there may be people from other bodies as well, and on the attendees list I know that there were some people from other organisations like professional bodies and commissioning organisations, those kinds of organisations too, so everybody is very welcome today. How do we produce it? So it's an evidence-based factual report. It was based on our assessments of education providers and programs from 21, 22 and 22, 23. And our quality assurance model enables us really to understand not just the problems that education providers and with programs, problems against our standards, but also how education providers have met our standards. So it enables us to understand approaches of education providers, and then we can then kind of draw those together and report on them. So the topic today, interprofessional education. So I'm just going to take a couple of slides here about standards link, and then I'm going to pass over to Louise, and she'll talk through our key findings. So we have a standard which requires interprofessional education. So I've drawn out a couple of key bits of language here. So that standards requires learners to learn with and from professionals and learners in other relevant professions. So by with and from, we mean that that learners need to learn with and from other people. It's a kind of it sounds like an obvious point, but we do need to, I think, underline that, because it's not just about learning with or from, it's both with and from other professional groups. We've also stated professionals and learners. So it's not just learners, there's the word and in there. And relevant professions. And this will depend on the profession that an education provider is delivering. What we normally mean by that is those professions who will work together in practice. So those might be HCPC professions, but they might also be other professions such as nurses or teachers, doctors, police, social workers, and the list there does go on. There is a bit of common misinterpretation on these points, which we will discuss through Louise's session as when she kind of kicks it off. Linking in with our standards of proficiency, so we consider that interprofessional education in training is integral to deliver our standards of proficiency. And I'm not going to read all of these out, but our standards of proficiency require learners to demonstrate knowledge, skills and behaviours such as, and then there's sort of a list there. So, learners need to understand the limits of their practice, when to seek advice or refer another professional service, need to be able to make and receive appropriate referrals, work in partnership with service users, carers, colleagues. So you can see that there is a clear link in our standards of proficiency, and requiring interprofessional education in learning and teaching is a very good way of supporting that our standards of proficiency are delivered by programs, so that learners can understand the groups that they work with. Will work with when in practice, and the things like the limits of others' responsibilities and what other professional groups do. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Louise now, who's going to take us through some of our findings. Thank you, Louise.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Louise. I'm Education Quality Officer for the region of Wales and the South West. And I'll be taking you through the rest of our slides up until the Q&A answer session. Okay, so our key findings. So we found that most education providers have good IPE in place. I'm going to refer to it as IPE because interprofessional education is quite a mouthful. We know that IPE positively impacts on learning linked to our standards of proficiency, our SOPs. Where education providers have identified gaps, we set expectations for them to improve in the short term, and that's either as part of their next performance review portfolio submission. We noted IPE is at its strongest when it's a key part of the institution, the division or the department strategy. So this means that it's properly integrated and embedded within programme delivery, within programme level outcomes and quality enhancement processes. On the flip side, we noticed that IPE was at its weakest when it's seen as supplementary or an additional element to programmes. Working with professionals and learners from other professions in practice learning settings can be a good part of IPE. And this works well when learners and practice educators are prepared and they have reflected on their interprofessional engagements. Next slide, please, Jamie. I've always wanted to say that. So good practice. What does good practice look like? Education providers normally have IPE leadership policies and procedures in place, which describe the approach and the methods used to enable learners on different programs from different professions to learn with and from each other. As I've said, IPE is at its strongest when it's considered a key part of the institution strategy, meaning it's properly integrated. It's at its strongest when IPE is embedded within learning outcomes. And it's well structured into program delivery and assessment. So, for example, delivery of sessions about multidisciplinary teams by staff with different professional backgrounds, multi-professional learner groups discussing case studies, structured assessments that are focused on multidisciplinary team situations. Learning with and from other professional groups is also often included in practice-based learning agreements. Next slide, please. Lovely. Multi-professional education providers. So we found strong IPE education providers delivering several allied health professions. And usually these were sat within the same administrative division, which has the overarching IPE leadership policies and procedures. Many education providers have a lead role for IPE, and we saw lots of good practice, such as IPE embedded into those learning outcomes. We found that education providers delivering one health or care profession needed to work slightly harder and think differently to embed IPE when compared to education providers delivering multiple health and care professions. So as I've already said, yeah, education providers have a lead role for IPE, and that is what works well. Next slide, please. So we have some external reference points. So it is considered really helpful, okay, when education providers use external frameworks and work with other industry bodies, as this shows they're considering good practice when developing their own approaches. This enables new thinking and ideas to inform education provider initiatives. So some external organisations, frameworks and initiatives are listed there. It also includes professional body expectations, the Centre for Advancement of Interprofessional Education, and the Heart and Soul movement, which is especially relevant to podiatrists and physiotherapists within HCPC professions. Next slide, please, Jamie. Oh, some common pitfalls. So some common problems that we found are identifying IPE as chance encounters. So these are by chance rather than structured engagement with other professionals and learners, or without supporting structures to ensure that learners are learning with and from others. Other common pitfalls include learning about professions within academic sessions without really the involvement of those professions, learning about cross-professional areas alongside other professions rather than actually engaging with those professions. And another common pitfall is a perception or the presentation by education providers or the understanding by learners that IPE is not a core activity. And that incorrect assumption can often be strengthened by IPE activities being optional rather than mandatory on their programs. Next slide, please. Challenges and developments. So we found that education providers delivering a smaller number of professions, limiting themselves to just those professions, can be challenging. Also challenging is the logistical alignment of timetables to facilitate face-to-face engagement. Problems driven by changes to on-site teaching or practice-based learning due to the pandemic, particularly those where opportunities were reduced for professional interaction and moved to virtual teaching and practice-based learning. Some education providers have identified weaknesses in their IPE through internal and external reviews and are making improvements. So, for example, some education providers identified that learners engaging with a broader range of professional groups would be beneficial. In these cases, education providers identified other relevant professions from different divisions within the education provider, which might not be naturally aligned. So, for example, speech and language therapists might work with educational psychologists. Next slide, please. Underdevelopment of IPE. Some education providers were less developed than we expected, and this was at times impacted by education providers finding it difficult to articulate how their IPE functioned. They might have difficulties in reflecting on the developments and challenges in this particular area. This may link to our findings from our annual year in registration survey. So we had 7% of respondents from the last survey reporting that they did not engage with other professions during their training. And 6% reporting engagement did not positively impact on their practice. We work with education providers through performance review to address or to set requirements to be met in future reviews. And we made the judgment that all providers continue to meet the relevant standard at the threshold level. Next slide, please. Some advice from us. Understand the specific requirements of the standard. So define which other professional groups are relevant to each programme you deliver, and clearly define your IPE approach. Make sure to embed this into your programme delivery. It may sound obvious, but monitor the effectiveness of your IPE. And be mindful that identifying an issue is not an issue in itself. This is a sign of a strength of good quality assurance. And lastly, to ensure that your learners really understand the benefits of working with other professional groups through their education and training and through into their practice placements.
I suppose the few further slides from us before we close this off. There is further reading material. So the Education Annual Report itself, obviously, and there are a couple of bits about IPE within that. It's quite a long document, but you should be able to find the relevant sections through the contents page. We referenced the year in registration survey, and actually I should just say that we will share these slides afterwards. We will provide you with these links, and we'll share the recording too. So the year in registration survey from 2023, there's some information on the third and fourth page about interprofessional education that was referenced by Louise in her presentation. We've just included a link to CAPE, because they're an organisation which is very interested in the advancement of interprofessional education. There's lots of good advice and guidance there for professional groups and also professional bodies. So we've linked to our page about professional bodies, but many professional bodies will also have good guidance about what to do from an IP perspective. We've also just referenced the Schwartz rounds that we included on the slide back there as well. This isn't the end of our engagement on our annual report. So we have a series of webinars. This is the 4th of 7 that we are doing today, more than halfway through now. Amazing. And so you can see the kind of recordings and the materials from previous ones by clicking on those links, and you can sign up for the future webinars. So the next one is on EDI, and it's on the 9th of July. And then we have a session on service users and carers, and then embedding the revised SOPs as well. And so if you're personally interested in this, or if there is anybody within your organizations that may be interested, then please sign up to those webinars, and we can have further kind of conversations and presentations there. And the only other thing that I would flag is that my members of my team, many of them are on the call today, but if you do have any kind of further points you want to discuss offline, not in a kind of public forum, then please get in touch with us. If you're not sure who to contact, there's a list of people on the slides here, and so please get in touch with your kind of regional lead from an education provider, or feel free to contact us on our main mailbox as well. Yes, and I think that will close us off for today. So short and sweet, I hope that's been informative for colleagues on the call. And thank you very much to Louise for your presentation. And yeah, it's been great to have lots of you in the room to talk about IPE, a really important area that we're focused on at HCPC. So thanks very much for your time, everybody, and we'll leave it there.